This is Zero Signal, where security leaders stop waiting for certainty and start leading through it. I'm Conor Sherman.
And I'm Stuart Mitchell.
Let's get into it. Zero Signal is brought to you by Cystic. Threat actors are compromising cloud accounts in under 8 minutes. Vulnerabilities are being exploited within 10 hours of disclosure. That's the defender's window, and it keeps closing. Attackers aren't waiting on dashboards. They go straight for what's running. Real time is the only timeline that matters. And that's why Forrester named Cystic a leader in its latest wave for the cloud-native application protection platforms. Runtime is where real risk shows up, and runtime is what Cystic is built for. So stop watching and start defending. Learn more at cystic.com and check out the link in the description. Today on Zero Signal, we're speaking with Sounil Yu, the creator of the Cyber Defense Matrix and the DIE Triad, co-founder and Chief AI Safety Officer at Gnostic, a Cybersecurity Hall of Fame inductee, a SANS Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, and one of the named contributors to the recent AI vulnerability storm, building a Mythos-ready security program whitepaper. Today, we're going to be diving into how to think more clearly when the ground is moving, how your TPRM program really isn't solving anything, and why security architectures like Zero Trust are having their moment again, so that you as a security leader can walk into your next boardroom conversation with a working distinction between what is a problem that you can solve versus a predicament you can only manage, and what is an architecture decision you've been outsourcing to a vendor so that you can allocate your team's attention, budget, and people accordingly. All right, let's bust into this. Sounil, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, mate. So you have spent over the last decade educating and leveling up how people are thinking, specifically security leaders. And you're talking a lot about these mental models, things, and they've made their expression in the Cyber Defense Matrix or the DIE Triad. And you've been really clear on this distinction between problems versus predicaments, which I've really appreciated. So I want to just start there. Nobody right now has a firm grasp on how, as a CISO, to arrive at this moment. And so I want to say, what are some of the ways that you're thinking about this moment of AI transformation? Security programs are being rethought of, from going back down to the studs. How do we as CISOs arrive at this moment with clearer thinking so that we can be better leaders?
Yeah, well, great question. I think it's one that we will struggle with now, but we'll struggle with again in the next year. Actually, 1 year is really far from now. I mean, if you think about open cloud, that was only 90 days ago. And you think, my goodness, I can barely predict what's going to happen 3 months from now. If you just consider the phenomenon that we call open cloud, and I think 5 years from now we'll look back at this time and we'll say, wow, these were simpler times. So, with that said, I think the perspective of how do you just stay ahead, or just how do you even stay current, let alone ahead, my thought is really changing how I think about the problem itself, and how do I even just understand what state are we in? How do we use concepts that we can easily grasp to then figure out what we do next? And one of my favorite mental models, so I use a lot of mental models to do this because it really helps shape how we think and how we should think about what's coming ahead. The cyber defense matrix that you mentioned earlier is really fundamentally a mental model. It's actually a collection of 3 mental models. One is the NIST cybersecurity framework, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Another one is 5 different types of assets that we care about: devices, apps, networks, data, users. And then the last one is the people, process, and technology. And the convergence of these 3 things ended up being really, really useful when I first shared it about 10 years ago, exactly. So, but the one that I think I use more frequently right now in the midst of change is something called the Cynefin model. And I think I pronounced that correctly, but it's spelled Cynefin. And this one was introduced to me by a guy named Mario, who shared it with me a couple of years ago. And it consists of 4 key phases. The 4 key phases go from chaos or chaotic to complex to complicated to clear. So there are many scenarios that we run into in the world where we're thrown into chaos and we want to quickly find our way back to clear. And understanding what stage you're at is actually really useful because then it gives us a sense of what you do next or what you should do to in the stage that you're in and what do you do next to move to the next stage. And so let's take all things just AI stuff in general. Many of us find ourselves in chaos. Okay. And so typically when you're in chaos, what the model suggests you do in chaos is simply just quickly just observe what's going on and just basically act. Okay, move in a direction. Basically, don't just stand still. Move somewhere. It's essentially when you're in chaos is the guidance that is given. Standing still is not going to help you get anywhere. Complex talks about basically running experiments. Okay, now that I'm moving, what if I go left or what if I go right? And I think this is where a lot of people in AI are like. This is where a lot of people who are in the AI journey are currently at today. You experiment, you try different things, and then eventually you figure out what kind of works, what doesn't work, and so things become complicated. It's not very easy to do these things, but it's doable. You know that this works, and you're in complicated, and eventually you refine it to make it better, and then you're in clear, and then something unexpected, some edge case appears, and you're thrown back into chaos. And this cycle repeats itself, and it's going to repeat itself over and over again. And it helps us just, it gives you a view that yes, you can get to clear one day,
Mhm.
and the sooner that you follow this methodology, the sooner you'll get there. But it also helps you brace for what's coming, which is chaos, and to know that this is normal, this is okay, and we'll get through it.
It is interesting that the advice for chaos is just move.
Mhm.
It feels like so many people are getting paralyzed at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. There's a whole bunch of analysis paralysis is absolutely one of the big challenges that we all have when it comes to organizations that are really risk averse.
Mm.
And of course, security is a very risk averse type of function. And so, in many ways, I do actually recommend to many people go experiment as a security function because that's how, if you think about it, that's actually how we in security just generally got started. We experimented, we tried different things, we broke things. And through that process, we understood what how it should be working. Now, of course, in security, we probably created chaos for other people, but nonetheless, it's a methodology that is pretty sound. One thing that you mentioned in the opening is this notion of problems and predicaments.
Mhm.
And what's also useful in this sort of four stage sequence is that when you're in chaos and when you're in complexity, you're typically the best you can do is really just manage your risks. You're in a predicament versus having problems. Problems you can look at as yes, there is a solution. You know how to. You know that there is a solution to a particular challenge, and it's just a matter of following a set of steps to make it happen. And so typically that emerges when you're in complicated and clear. So when you're in chaos and when you're in chaotic and complex, those are predicaments. When you're in complicated and clear, those are problems. You typically look for technology when it's a problem because you know that a technology can actually solve something. And when it's a predicament, you're typically looking for services or you're typically trying to figure out a process that will work. And this is where I think a lot of times we confuse a problem from a predicament. We think that, let's say, for example, you mentioned third party risk management. We see that as a lot of us see it as a problem.
Mhm.
Surely this vendor questionnaire that we give them, that will solve the problem. And anyone who's been through that ordeal, either receiving or on the receiving end or on the sending end, know that it really doesn't actually solve a problem. It addresses a predicament, which is we are dependent upon this supply chain that has all these different flaws of some sort, And so the best we can do is to manage our risks, which is why it's called third-party risk management.
Right.
But we see it as a third-party go fix, and it's not really something you can fix. Again, the best you can do is to manage your risks. And do the surveys really help us manage those risks?
I have my point of view, but yeah.
Well, yeah, at some level, it helps us give some perspective of how big the risk might be. But in many ways, I think you should come in with a perspective that all your third parties can get compromised at some level or another. And how do you buffer against that as an organization? That's how you should look at a predicament. Whereas,
So-
again, a problem you just try to fix.
I want to expand on that topic a little bit more because I think that's actually quite of a powerful distinction to be made. And I could imagine the confusion of a problem and a predicament leading to a poor framing of a lot of conversations in the boardroom or in strategy conversations, which then ultimately manifest themselves downstream in really negative ways.
Mhm.
So if you again, if imagine yourself, you're walking in the boardroom, you're giving an update, and the conversation is going to be around threat actors leveraging AI to collapsing timeframes for exploitation. It's like, okay, we got to get our hands around that. What part of that scenario is a predicament? What part of that scenario becomes a problem? How would a CISO navigate that particular moment so that they could be a better advisor to their peer group?
Again, it goes back to terminology to some degree. We are oftentimes asked by the board, by our senior stakeholders, hey, are we secure? And our answer is, no, we're never actually secure because it is a risk that we have to manage, but it's not a risk or it's not a problem that we can just completely solve, right? So just recognize that there's always a non-zero probability that we will get compromised despite the best efforts of the team, of the company, so on and so forth. So recognizing that we might be compromised, at the end of the day, we are taking risks as an organization to enable certain or to enable the business to do certain things that may result in some of these hazardous situations. But we're doing that in a calculated way. And the cyber defense matrix that I mentioned earlier, I've seen a couple of folks use it in board level conversations, but I've seen it quite frequently used in the context of managed service providers who are trying to convince their clients and customers, hey, here's the controls that you need. And it provides a single page sort of comprehensive view of what kind of services that they can potentially use. For those listeners, to give you a sense of the cyber defense matrix, it is a 5x5 matrix. Okay, and one of the key things that people confuse in this 5x5 matrix is this perception that you have to check every one of those boxes in the cyber defense matrix. Okay, so it is like a bingo card, but we're playing bingo here, folks. We're not playing Blackout. Okay, and if we're trying to play Blackout, you're going to spend a lot of money, and if you're competing with other people, you're going to lose a lot because everyone else is playing bingo and you're playing Blackout. So this perspective that we have to check every one of these boxes to be quote secure is a financially it's unwise financially. So the basic view then of risk management in cybersecurity is which of these boxes are we going to leave unchecked?
Mm.
Okay, and it's a very deliberate sort of cost calculus decision that one has to make to say, yes, I recognize that I could get harmed here in this particular part of my environment, but given that I only have 10 chips to put down on my bingo card, I'm going to leave the equivalent of 15 unguarded, so to speak. And that is those are hard decisions to make, but that's the kind of decisions that we have to make as security practitioners because we can't guard everything. And in the context of this upcoming wave of patches and vulnerabilities that we should expect to see over the next couple weeks to months, we're going to be in a situation where our teams are going to be stretched thin. And this whole sort of, we're going to have to go from we know what the solution is because we can patch this to we're now in a predicament because we really can't patch everything in the time frame. It's really, it's in fact, it's gone from hey, we think we know how to run patch management in roughly in this sort of time frame to oh my goodness, what happens when you have a tsunami of patches? We're now thrown into chaos, and we don't necessarily have a easy solution, a fix to the problem. We have to manage our risks, which means we'll have to figure out what things are we going to let go vulnerable and which things are we not going to let be vulnerable.
That's a really good framing of it. And it's just like a slight twist on it. But that sense of your analogy of blackout, where the goal is to have a checkbox across the whole matrix, and then you put your little dot, versus bingo, where you're being selective and where you put your chips. We always talk about that in cybersecurity. Like, we often frame it like, okay, where are you making your investments? But I actually much prefer your framing, which is, where are you not putting your investments? Now, we implicitly say that and we implicitly do that. But if you actually flipped on its head and say, okay, I'm going to actively not invest here, or I'm going to actively defund these parts, then you can figure out where to fund. It is actually a very different thought exercise to go through. Um, so yeah, I just appreciated that thinking as you were describing. I'm like, yeah, that is a really healthy exercise to go through, especially if you can do it with your peer group. Talk to your CFO, talk to your general counsel, your heads of engineering, and be like, all right, I believe these are the areas that we should not protect. And just watch their faces go flush and be like, what
Yeah.
is this Conor on about? But yeah, I think that's a really healthy exercise.
Well, so let's now give them an option, an alternative. So if we're not going to defend this, and I use another sort of analogy or mental model here, if we're not going to defend this pet that you have, then what do we want to do with this pet? And the answer is, well, we may have to put this pet down. And any pet owner who has a pet, that's not a fun proposition. But let's change the word pet into something that most businesses also understand. It's called a legacy system. Okay,
Mhm.
and decommissioning a legacy system is a very hard, arduous effort. And one of the reasons why we have difficulty doing that is because, well, it takes a lot of effort on the part of this teams, the system, the folks who run and maintain these systems to refactor and move to something else.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we have an opportunity, right? The difficulty of refactoring old, antiquated code into something that's more modern is now upon us and greatly assisted through these AI coding agents. And we should absolutely be taking advantage of that. So in many ways, we're also telling our engineering brethren, hey, we don't want to secure this legacy systems. We don't, as veterinarians, have too many pets that are sick right now or are going to get sick.
Yeah.
And we have an opportunity for us to just, some of these really sick ones we just have to put down. But you guys have to think about what's going to replace these. And what's going to replace them is not pets, but cattle. Cattle are designed to be what I call distributed immutable ephemeral, or DIE. And by making something more distributed, immutable, or ephemeral, it actually offsets my job as a veterinarian, which is to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of those resources. But the more DIE something is, the less CIA I need to actually put in. In other words, if I have something that is very distributed, I don't need to worry about the availability of something. If it's very immutable, I don't need to worry about the integrity of that thing. And if it's very ephemeral, very short lived, then I also offload my burden or lessen my burden for confidentiality. Anyway, the basic premise here, just conceptually, it's if an asset is designed to be very short lived and go away and to be as plentiful as I need it to be and unchanging when I deploy it, well, then a lot of the core concerns I have around security it just lowers my burden. And so, if I'm a veterinarian, I would rather my job. I would rather be a pet control officer
Mhm.
that limits the introduction of new pets, rather than having to always be a veterinarian that has to take care of all these sick pets that the business brings to me.
I like how you've by changing the framing from CIA to DIE, you actually are introducing an entirely like the second order effect of that is that you're going to have a new architecture. And I think that is a really interesting transition because when I think about like most people in the moment of AI, I have heard about we've all known about zero trust architectures for some time. When it was released, the vendor community picked it up and said, "Great news! I'm going to sell you Zero trust. And if you just sign here, you too could be the proud owner of a SKU that says zero trust on it. And so I wanted to actually go down that path, and we'll transition over to that, because if I take this idea of we're moving away from CIA, we're prioritizing DIE, we're moving from CIA to DIE, we do that, that's an architecture shift. So tell me about the architecture shift with zero trust. Why are most security leaders not realizing the benefits of what they think they are? Why is it that the really good idea, these really good principles that are in this architecture, actually not making their way to practice as we kind of thought they might have a few years ago?
Yeah, so I think personally that architecture is going to have their renaissance moment. We've struggled collectively, not architects only, but we collectively have struggled to say what, we design these amazing approaches for doing stuff, and we're like, why doesn't anybody do this? Okay, a great example would be just like software development. We've had secure software development frameworks and ways and whole maturity models in software development for years and years, and we're like, how come people don't follow these basic frameworks and basic architectures for secure software development? And of course, the answer is because it just takes time and effort and energy, and we have a lot of other things to worry about, and blah 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 blah. Okay, but enter AI that can help offload a lot of that grunt work, the toil of doing things, which actually frees us up to take a step back and design things. So I think it's going to have a renaissance moment because the effort of actually doing things takes away time for us in designing things. And now that we have more time to design, I'm actually seeing a whole bunch of architecture work being happening all over the place. And so let me explain what I mean by that. And I'm using the word architecture very loosely here. I see it as an umbrella term for things like agentic frameworks and harnesses and scaffolds. And within the AI ecosystem, we're seeing there's so many different parts that make up this overall architecture, like skills and plugins and hooks and LLMs and LSPs and memory and permissions and all these other sort of things that come together. These have always been there. These aren't necessarily new things, but they are now part of this environment that, properly assembled, it produces some amazing, very robust structures that are able to produce high quality code, high quality and secure code. And so it's just a matter of knowing what the right architecture is. The beautiful thing is we actually know what the right architecture is for a lot of these, and it's just a matter of expressing it and putting the right scaffolding around these AI agents so that they produce these higher quality outcomes. A great example of this is actually Mythos itself. So when Anthropic directed Mythos to go find stuff, find vulnerabilities, they actually put no architecture around it. They just said, go find vulnerabilities, or rather, you're playing in a CTF, go find vulnerabilities, put whatever you find in a report here.
Yeah.
And that was it. So essentially no architecture whatsoever. But there was another company, Isle, who basically said, look, let's put some basic scaffolding around some of the older models and see if it finds the same vulnerabilities. And voila, it did. So in other words, the mental model I want people to consider is, there were the three little pigs. They can build with straw, wood, and brick. And if you consider the story, most people leave thinking, oh, we should go build the brick. But the reality is, you could have built a really, really resilient, wind-resilient straw house. So using the same materials, you could have built a better house with better architecture. And so what Iowa did was they used essentially the equivalent of straw and sticks, but put better framing and structure around it and had a much stronger house than even Mythos by itself. Or maybe, we'll see. Mythos, now, now the real challenge and the real scary thing is, what if you put even that basic scaffolding on Mythos?
Right.
What will it find? And I think if you consider the recent Mozilla announcement of like 270 plus vulnerabilities that were discovered, which was I think 10 or 20 times just the normal volume that they discover regularly. that gives you a hint as to what it can potentially do or what we should be prepared for.
Yeah. At the time of disclosure, and there's been more that have come out since that, but at the time of the release of Mythos, when the Red Team report released their report that came with it, the Opus 4.6 had found 2 working exploits inside the JavaScript engine in Firefox, and Mythos just by itself without scaffolding had found 186. That's almost a 10x difference, and they found more since then, getting us clear above the 200, which is quite a delta. And I think that's a really interesting point you're putting in there. It's like the thing that they won't release to the internet, they won't give out because it's too dangerous. You can actually get the same level of offensive capability with the right levels of agents and frameworks and architecture around it and scaffolding around it. I've seen some reports that say just basic scaffolding will increase your success on a benchmark by 5 to 15 points, depending on the benchmark and the quality of the scaffolding, which is kind of shocking considering, like, to your point, that most of these what generally available models are about that distance from Mythos.
Mhm.
And so, now you can make the argument. It's like, well, actually, we have this capability. You just need to give it a little TLC, and then the threat actor can have this level of capability.
Yeah, and so if you consider like Opus 4.5 as like wood and Opus 4.7 as brick, uh, Mythos is probably like steel, or
Right.
some future model will be titanium reinforced carbon nanotubes or something like that, and we'll create more ambitious projects from those sort of things. Who knows? We'll build the equivalent of a space elevator, which requires whole new architectures and whole new ways of thinking about how to create the proper scaffolding around these more ambitious projects. But yes, you can still build a pretty tall building with steel, equivalently tall building of what you can do with bricks or with wood. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I think that is again, the scary part is that we're seeing a something that's actually, I think, is actually underhyped, because these as the materials get better, with good scaffolding, with good architecture, you end up being able to produce even much better buildings as well. And it's funny because when steel and the material science got better, we actually saw an exponential growth in the size of buildings. Okay, and so we're at this exponential curve of finding vulnerabilities, and it will be. I don't think no team is currently exponentially ready to handle that. However, going back to the original premise of the question, we have this notion of trust architectures, which is really about how do you take the existing materials you already have and reassemble it in a way that is far more robust in the context of whatever hurricane that's going to hit us. And so, to your point, this is why buying zero trust doesn't make sense. You've already bought the core materials. You already have the bricks in front of you. It's just now a matter of assembling them properly. And again, we've known how to assemble them for a long time, but it may require us to. Well, I mean, if you've already built a crappy brick building with poor architecture, it does require you to take it down, right, and to rebuild it again. The effort for rebuilding, though, depending upon the type of environment you're in, going back to the earlier point about the cats and cattle and pets and cattle, your old antiquated brick building that is about to fall down is a pet. We may want to, people are going to want to hold on to that pet when there's really an opportunity to rebuild that with a lot of the zero trust principles in mind and make it a much more solid building for the future.
Zero Signal is brought to you by Hampton North. I've been responsible for building and turning around cybersecurity programs for companies where a lapse in security just isn't an option. Finance, high tech, AI. Different domains, but the same truth. The programs live and die on talent. And no strategy ships without the right people who share the right DNA. That's why I partner with Hampton North. I've built 3 cybersecurity teams with them, and every time they move faster than anyone else without sacrificing quality. While other agencies are still pushing paperwork, Hampton North already had vetted candidates in front of me. Their executive search is not one size fits all. With one of the largest networks of security leaders in the US, their leadership roles hit the market in days, sometimes hours. And their go-to-market practice covers CROs, CMOs, revenue leaders, and full team build-outs for scaling cybersecurity businesses. They meet every candidate, they reference every story. If you're ready to build and scale and grow your security program, go to hamptonnorth.com and see why brands like Clear, Instacart, Airtable, and OpenAI trust Hampton North to build great teams. Check out the link in the description. So can we go down that path a little farther too? Let's think about this. Most security leaders in this moment were trying to prepare for that hurricane that is coming. And you're right, we have a lot of the core ingredients. We have a lot of the core capabilities to like prepare for this. But what's that bridge look like? What are some of the architectural principles, or where should security leaders be thinking like to do differently in this moment than they have done historically to prepare for the hurricane that is coming?
So one of them is something that traditionally has been somewhat challenging for us to implement. It's called egress filtering. So there's zero trust controls we have on the inbound, in the sense of how do we ensure that the user and the entity that I'm working with is truly who it is, and not to assume that it just reachability means that they're authorized to hit me. That part we've come up with elegant ways to address that. We haven't really come up with elegant ways to manage the egress side of it, because the egress is also a really, really useful control. And it's one that has stopped a lot of past attacks as well, whether it's Log4j or SolarWinds. Those who had egress filtering did not have an issue. I mean, they may have had an inbound issue, but they did not have the outbound where the attackers were able to actually meaningfully do anything with it. So those who had good egress filtering. And what is egress filtering? It's having a very defined set of this is what this system can how this system can communicate out and with whom. And so if you have servers that would be that consider critical in any sort of way, the egress filtering is a useful mechanism. However, the challenge is knowing what egress rules to put in. But this is something, again, this isn't rocket science. It's like we know what the rules are, we know what the rules should be because, well, we can easily observe the traffic and then just basically put that into your egress filters. And this is where, again, AI systems can help us really. It doesn't really require much AI help here. It's a very straightforward architectural principle, but it just takes effort to do it and to manage it. And perhaps the management side of it is where we can have agents help us here as well. But yeah, much of our cloud environments are really well designed to be accessible via API and to put those egress rules in. It's just not a practice that is uh, commonly followed. But I think this is another case where having AI systems that can basically do that as a basic practice for us is something that and equips defenders to basically be prepared for the hurricane that's coming.
I think it's really good. And we're seeing there are some, for anyone who's like listening to this and like, okay, I want to explore and get started with this. There are great technologies that are just being open sourced. There's a project thing Brex put out called like open sorry, the name just escaped me. I'm gonna have to put it in the show notes. Yep, my name has gone completely blank. Anyway, I cannot think of it right now. So there's a lot of great tools. Crab Trap, that is it. Okay, sorry everyone in the audience who just watched me go through my whole mental process there. But yeah, there's like tools like Crab Trap that come out and they're meant for exactly that. You run it alongside your agent. It looks at all the traffic and then leverages some LLMs to say, okay, here's this blend of like deterministic rules and LLM oriented rules at runtime around this. And I thought that was a good example of just a tool that's available in the open source community right now to help with the egress filtering. I did want to come back and like level this up a little bit too. So if we zoom out for what we're discussing here, where we've got this architecture and we're starting to say, okay, we understand when there are architectural principles from zero trust that we want to bring in, that's important. That leads to technology choices that come out of it. Then there's these different ways we need to start thinking about it as security leaders. When a security leader steps into the room with the board, or I often think like their peer groups, like we spend most of our time dealing with our peer group. We meet with our board far less frequently than that. And they're being asked to demonstrate like their AI security strategy. It's a really tall order at the moment. I'm curious how you're seeing, what are some of the successful patterns that people are applying when they say, when they want to have an effective AI security strategy, when the CTO doesn't necessarily have a great AI strategy. How should security leaders be walking into those conversations? What are some of the mental models, or what are some of the approaches we should be taking so that we can have good answers to questions like, what is your security strategy for our AI infrastructure?
Sure. Yeah. So let me actually use an analogy here. I'll go back to the cyber defense matrix for a moment as well. So the cyber defense matrix, one of the analogies I use with it is the analogy of cooking. So it's like saying, okay, well, what are you having for dinner tonight? What's your strategy for cooking dinner tonight? And if you're asking that question of just anybody, the first kind of question you might want to ask is, well, I don't know, what ingredients do you have? Okay. Another one might be, well, do you have any allergies? And generally speaking, you also care about nutritional needs. You want to make sure that your nutritional needs are also being met as well. And so there's a combination of factors that make potentially your environment somewhat unique compared to others. Okay, especially the allergies. Different different business units have different allergies. Developers have different allergies than people who work from home, which have different allergies than people who are at the office. You have some folks who have lots of allergies, like your surgeons and generals and your CEOs and executives of the company. You have other people who have basically no allergies, like your call centers. Okay, meaning I can put controls on these different types of folks, rather the controls I put on to different folks. They may break out with allergic reactions and say, I can't do this because it prevents me from being able to do business." A great example from one of my previous employers is a high-speed trading environment. What do you mean you can't put in a basic firewall? I mean, firewalls like such what we call the basics, right?
Hmm.
And yet, a firewall would completely wreck their business because they're highly, highly allergic to anything that slows them down. It's high speed trading after all, right? And so, this perspective of understanding what your allergies are is, I think, one of the first things that we should really calibrate on before we say, okay, well, tell me what your security strategy is, because your security strategy may be wholly unfit for my organization because it's full of, I don't know, gluten and peanuts and I don't know, whatever people are allergic to nowadays. Fortunately, I have no allergy, so I live in this, and none of my kids do either. So thankful for that. But anyway, that said, the perspective of what allergies do you have might be a good starting point. But let's talk about it in the context of something that's a bit more tradable or shareable, because it turns out that if you have developers and I have developers, they generally have the same allergies. Your developers, let me guess, they want full admin rights on their machine. Okay.
Yep.
And I understand that problem because when you develop software, um, it's new and it's always running something that has never been seen before. And that triggers a whole bunch of alerts that we security people are concerned about. And you need to execute this on your machine without the constraints that we oftentimes impose on people who don't write code all the time. So anyway, that's an example of an analogy that means that if you have developers and I have developers, there could be a shared sort of model for how we think about what our security strategy is when it comes to compensating for those allergies. Okay, so we can't remove admin rights completely from your machine. What can we do? What is it that you're doing? What's your strategy for this? Because I'm at a loss. But whatever strategy you might have for how to manage admin rights for developers, probably, well, there's a degree of how much uh, how much, what sort of
Sensitivity.
reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, we're going to say, you know what, that seems like a reasonable approach, and I will go and adopt that security strategy for that type of allergy. And I think that's where we have an opportunity to share and say, okay, that makes a lot of sense because we have similar sort of needs when it comes to different, the makeup of different business units within our respective teams. You have a sales team, I have a sales team. You have a marketing team, I have a marketing team. And more than likely, they'll resemble or they'll have similar sort of characteristics.
Hmm.
Okay, all that said, we have a new problem that has emerged, which is these AI tools are turning everyone into developers. Okay. Does that mean everyone should have, anyway, well, everyone have the same allergies at that point? And so I think I'm starting to struggle to understand how to apply that model when it comes to this convergence of functions across team members that never they were never designed, their system was not designed to support this type of function. And so now now that we're exposing more and more of these functions, capabilities to non-developers or people who aren't in sales but can do sales type of functions through these AI agents, it's starting to get very challenging to exercise to avoid all these different allergies that you could isolate within different business units. So I haven't figured that out. I think that may be that's a new chaotic problem that we'll have to work our way through.
It'll be interesting if we start to have agents with allergies. Start to say, okay, hey, we find under these circumstances, we get less performant or we get more performant. Actually, as we begin to wrap on this particular conversation, there is something I did really want to make sure we take time to like explore and expand on. And that is just the cognitive impact that agentic work is going to have on the workforce at large. I'm just curious your perspective on this. If you think that most organizations that are trying to go through this transformation are just like cognitively ready for agentic AI, are we ready to make the change so we can adopt this new way of thinking, this new way of doing work?
Yeah, so let's talk about what the new way of doing work is and what it foretells. So one perspective is that there's no more individual contributor. Every individual contributor should be a manager or a task master of at least 10 agents, if not more. And what I mean is that essentially every new entry level job is a taskmaster now. You have to be a taskmaster, meaning that you will now have at your disposal other entities that you can assign work, and your job is really to oversee that work, which usually we don't give to entry level folks because when you give entry level folks management responsibilities over people, they'll get it wrong. Freaking, they're learning through that process. But when you're giving it an entry level person access to a non human agent, then they can make mistakes and that's okay. But what you want them to learn is how do you think about the work that you're given and separate, task that out to different folks. So it's a different type of cognitive level, a cognitive workload, because now you're being asked to design the work, not just do the work. There's also another perspective within the context of psychology. It's called System 1 versus System 2 thinking. It was captured in Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. As a default mode of how we operate in System 1. 95% of our cognitive effort is in System 1. And it's this very quick heuristic sort of mechanism for how we work. System 2, we only spend 5% of our time. And System 2 is really where the risk management type of functions happen in our brain. For those who are familiar with cyber risk quantification is absolutely System 2. Red, yellow, green is System 1. Who here loves cyber risk quantification, doing it every day? And of course, the answer is nobody, very few, right? Why? It's because it's cognitively heavy. And so what we're actually asking a lot of folks to potentially do is, as a taskmaster of agents, is to actually spend more time in System 2 to design things and to organize things, to create these architectures and task work out accordingly. And that is going to be, again, it is a level up in one's thinking skills, but it is going to be something that I think every organization should be working towards. But there's also another perspective, which is just because I make a individual 10 times more productive doesn't necessarily make the organization 10 times more productive. So what I would also have people consider is, what does your organization look like, or how should it be reorganized if you hired, or if it grew 10 times in size? If you have a 300 person organization, what does a 3,000 person organization look like, and how would you reorg it? Because if you have a 3,000 person organization still operating within the org chart of a 300 person organization, you're not going to get be able to reap the benefits of a true 3,000 person organization. In fact, you'll probably have a lot of chaos, which is why we reorg. And no one loves reorgs, okay? But the reorgs happen because the company grows and it needs to find more efficient ways to operate to make sure that information flows in the right ways and so on and so forth. And so I don't think people are prepared to reorg right now, given that the headcount has remained the same or maybe even shrunk. And yet, actually, the number of entities have increased by maybe 10 times or more, but they're not seeing the efficiencies because they haven't reorged to account for the fact that you now have that many more entities in your midst.
That's a really good point. I just want to make sure I underscored that. Until now, cognition has been a one-to-one relationship with the person. And we've divorced those two by creating where we are now with our technology. So you've actually 10x your cognition. And if you've 10x your cognition, is your business designed to handle that, even if the people there are remaining largely flat? It's a really good observation. What are some of the design patterns that you think people should be like looking forward to? Because obviously we're going to discover this together as we rebuild the economy from traditional technology to AI-oriented technology. I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the early indicators of like we're heading in the right direction for designing an organization where we've 10x'd cognition?
Yeah. So what's actually really fascinating for me here is usually as an individual, we're looking at this very unknown space because many of us never had the experience of managing an organization that is 10 times the size that you currently are at now. Okay. Yet there exists plentiful number of patterns already out there for what a 10 times size organization, how that's worked today. So if you're again in a 100 person organization, there absolutely exist 3,000 person organizations. And you can look at the org chart and say, okay, what is it that they did to manage this size organization? In other words, it exists. There is a 3,000 person organization, but the person that is at the helm of a 300 person organization may not ever have that hasn't had the experience of running a 3,000 person organization. And therefore, they're like, what do I do? And yet the pattern is actually already there if you look for it. Now, at the same time, there are some organizations that like no one's ever run a 10 million person. Well, there probably is a train company in India that has a 10 million person organization, but those are rare, right? They're very rare. At certain scales, it's very rare to find design patterns that you can point to and say, okay, here's how you run such an organization. But at the lower scales, there's absolutely patterns, but we individually are oftentimes not aware of them. The ones who are aware of them are actually the ones that have gone from large organizations to smaller ones. And so, for example, military. If you've been in the military, that is you're inside a very large organization. You know how that organization runs. And most folks from the military will go into a corporate sector, private sector company, and they'll be like, "Oh, I know how to run this because I've run this type of organization of this size before." So anyway, those are the ones. Those who've had the experience of seeing larger organizations and going to smaller ones will probably see like, "Oh, I think I've seen how to manage this." But for those who are growing into larger and larger organizations, will probably look at it and say, "I have no idea what this looks like," because they've never seen it before, and yet the patterns are actually already there.
That's a really good insight, and I love that. I love that nugget, that idea. That's like the minute you go to embark on a novel exploration, just remember it's probably not that novel, and someone else has done it, and the pattern is already out there. With that, Sounil, I think we are going to land the plane there. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show today. I've really enjoyed stepping through these models with you and just you opening up my way of thinking and our audience way of thinking and just thinking at a higher order of magnitude across this really interesting and time of incredible change. So just thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
As a reminder, Sounil Yu is the creator of the Cyber Defense Matrix, the DIE Triad, and the co-founder and chief AI safety officer at Gnostic. Again, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
If today's conversation gave you something useful, a framework, a question worth sitting with, a way to position something you're already dealing with, that's the point. Connect with Conor and I on LinkedIn. The links are in the show notes. Tell us what landed.
And if you know another security leader who's navigating the same pressure, text them this episode. We'll see you next time.
resonate.